Okay, hello everyone, good afternoon. Welcome, I'm Anne Janad. I'm a PhD student in the School of Environment and Natural Resources at Ohio State University. I'm working with Dr. Jeffrey Jaquette here at OSU and Dr. Julia Haggerty at Montana State. They are co-PIs on this larger NSF-funded Energy Impacts Research Coordination Network project, of which this webinar series, this Community Impacts of Energy Development webinar series, is a production. So I should say that Mark Skidmore, the director of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development, unfortunately can't be with us today, but in his absence, I will do my best. So this webinar series is produced in partnership with the NCRCRD, and Mark Skidmore and Rosa Solis there have been incredibly instrumental in supporting this work and this project. So we're really thankful for them and for their partnership. I should also just note that we have one more webinar in this series that we'll be hosting April 13th, and that will address research in the area of energy law and policy. So we encourage you to attend that as well. And you can find more information about that webinar as well as links to this and past webinars at energyimpacts.org/webinars. So before we get started, I would just like to quickly plug the first Energy Impacts Symposium, which we're planning now. It will, in a number of ways, sort of be a culmination of this RCN project. It's going to be held here at OSU in Columbus, Ohio this summer, July 26th through 27th, 2017. So paper, presentation, and poster abstract submissions are open now, as well as a call for book chapter abstracts. And we have fellowship and travel scholarship funding that's all-inclusive for up to 20 graduate students and early career scholars to present at the symposium. So panelists today, and then grad students that might be participating in the webinar wherever you are, as well as professionals with paper or poster abstracts to submit. I encourage you to go to energyimpacts.org/symposium for more information. And then also quickly, I just want to encourage folks to sign up for the Social Science and Energy Research Directory that we have as part of the RCN. So this is a pretty awesome tool. You can search for social science and energy research and researchers by social science discipline, by geography, by energy regime and technology, or just folks' names if that's what you have. We probably at this point have close to 130 or so researchers. If you're a researcher in this field, you can create your profile. There's a map functionality to the directory, so you can find people by where they're located or where they conduct their research. So definitely check that out. And I would just like to quickly say today's webinar is particularly exciting for me because we're highlighting the work of my fellow graduate students and one recent PhD. These folks' work cuts across energy regimes and geographies. It's incredibly interesting, it's salient, it's timely. I personally admire and respect them and their work very much. So we have 4 presenters in total today from the United States and Australia. I feel a little bit bad that we've asked each of them to limit their time to just 8 to 10 minutes. So unfortunately, we'll only get a small flavor of what they're working on. But we're nonetheless really excited to have Dylan Bugden, the PhD candidate from Cornell University, Dr. Beck Colvin at the Australian National University, Emily Gruber, PhD candidate at Stanford University, and Sean Olson-Hasboon, PhD candidate at Utah State University. And so please, if you have questions or comments, which we really hope that you do, just type them into that text field in the bottom left corner of your screen, and we'll make sure to get to those at the end. So we will get started with Dr. Rebecca Colvin at Australian National University. So Beck is the Knowledge Exchange Specialist at the Climate Change Institute at the Australian National University, and her role with the CCI is to facilitate the strengthening of links between climate change researchers and then the end users of their research. Her research interests include how people connect to each other to bridge disciplinary divides, as well as the social influences on decision making. So super interesting. So Beck, if you're ready, I will pass it over to you.
Okay, thanks Anne, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm really excited to be talking in this sort of forum. I think this is a great thing that you're all doing to bring all of us researchers together. Anyway, I know I've only got 8 to 10 minutes, so I should get started. So I'm going to talk about some research that I did as part of my PhD, which was examining how an engagement process for a wind energy development led to some fairly poor, I suppose, outcomes for the community. And so this was in King Island, which is a very nice little island down at the south of Australia. It's about 67 kilometres, I think, north to south and just under 30 east to west. And the population's about 1,500 people. And so they've got space, but they've also got that feeling that they're all on a little island together. And so back in 2012, Hydro Tasmania, which is a government-owned corporation, proposed a very large-scale wind energy development. This would have been, sorry, I just realised I've spoken kilometres. I hope you can work out what that means. So the development would have been about 200 turbines of 150 metres tall. So what's that? 450, 500 feet. Would have taken up about 20% of the island in terms of the footprint of the development. And so I'm clicking through some quotes from interviews I did with people about what happened in the community there, so you can have a read through while I'm talking. Now, what made this such an interesting case was that the company adopted what they referred to as best practice community engagement. And according to academics and looking at what they did, they certainly did meet a lot of the things that we would say you should do if you want to do good community engagement. They engaged early, from before the project had gone to the feasibility stage. They established a community consultative committee. They had a vote with the community about whether the proposal should proceed from the pre-feasibility stage to the feasibility stage, and they ran lots of sessions and lots of information exchange. This is a diagram that shows what the company said their engagement process would be, and what's most important for our discussion is where you can see those little diagonal boxes with dotted lines around them. Those are all the places in the process where the company said they wouldn't proceed past that point without community support. So for a non-community owned development, and for something of this scale, that's quite a significant commitment to the community. And so according to the people in the community, this is what happened. So quite a different view from the company's perspective. And now the proposal hasn't gone ahead. It was announced in 2012, and in 2014, about 2 years later, it was announced that it wouldn't proceed due to economic reasons. But they only got a tiny bit of the way into the feasibility stage. So that's this second stage along here. Mind you, this is everything that the community saw happen in that time. And so I'm going to talk about some of the things that were really critical to why the impacts on the community turned out to be so significant, given the view that this was best practice community engagement. So first of all, the company started with pre-feasibility engagement. Now there were some challenges here, and this goes back to what was happening in King Island before there was any mention of this proposal. So the island has a dairy industry and beef industry, and quite suddenly in 2012, the abattoir that the beef farmers rely on was closed down by the multinational company that owns it. So immediately about 90 jobs were lost, and overheads for beef farmers were increased significantly. So this put the island into a state of vulnerability. And it was in this context that there had been some, at this stage, confidential discussions between some members of the King Island Council and Hydro Tasmania. But somehow a rumour got out about a $2 billion project that was coming to King Island. And so in this vulnerable context, this rumour was seen to be kind of like a life raft. Like, don't fret, something's going to come along and make things better for us. But it led to rumouring, and it led to all sorts of suspicions and arguments, even before anyone knew this was a wind energy development. So some people thought it would be a spy facility, others thought it would be an immigration detention centre, which is very contentious in Australia, sand mining, gas mining, and so on. And so in this pre-feasibility engagement, which we think of as being a really good thing to do, it started off from the back foot, because when the proposal was announced, and it was announced to be a wind energy development, a huge number of people thought that's not what I was hoping for, and I'm really let down, and I'm not happy about this at all. And so as the proposal moved on, as more details were released to the community and the engagement started happening, although it was at that pre-feasibility stage, which allows people to have input from an early point, it meant that the details that were available weren't for sure. So there was a lot of broad conceptual information, but not much on the specifics. So for people who were concerned about how this would affect an important landscape or a particular amenity or scenic part of the island, they just didn't know for sure whether this would be built next to their school or next to their favourite beach or next to a special place. And so this uncertainty meant that there was a lot of debate and discussion. Some people saw some details as certain while others didn't. And now at this stage, a community consultative committee was established. Again, a really good thing to do, but there were some issues here as well. So it was comprised of 17 people from the community, including the chair of the committee was from the community. And now this is where there is a little bit of a difference between what happened and what is recommended, because what is recommended is that you have a third-party facilitator in order to keep the committee on track. But without that third-party facilitator, we saw issues happen within this committee where, and this is not a reflection on the behaviour of the chair at all, but people from outside of the committee formed their own perceptions about what the people in the committee thought and what they were doing. And so without that third-party facilitator, there were some issues of legitimacy that went missing, or that happened actually, sorry, the issues happened, but the perceptions of legitimacy went missing rather. And so other issues with the community consultative committee was lacking that facilitator. It meant that people in the committee ended up forming factional groups, I suppose you could say. And so there was mixed messages coming from the community, and this meant from the committee, and this meant that the community didn't see the committee as the authoritative source of information that it could be. Now there was also a community vote, and this sounds like a great thing to do, like it's a really democratic thing, but unfortunately it led to some really bad outcomes for the community. So initially this was going to be a survey about social acceptance of the proposal, and so this was toward the end of the pre-feasibility stage. But the committee and others in the community said, you're asking us anyway, and you've said you're not going to proceed without our support, so you may as well as make that survey a vote, and the company agreed. And now the problem with the vote was that people went into election mode. There were signs everywhere, there were posters, and there were people that really withdrew during this time because of the pressure to disclose how they were going to vote. And it also meant that people who were either unsure or ambivalent, or perhaps even just a little bit open to the idea or a little bit close to the idea, would have to choose a side, essentially. Were they yes or were they no? And now this reflects the issue with the place for the opposition. So although there was this facilitated engagement system, it didn't really have anywhere for the people who were just hardline opposition to go. And so those people who were strongly opposed to it formed their own group called the No Tas Wind Farm Group, and they ended up having to operate in a space outside of that engagement system. So within the engagement process, it was space for people who were willing to engage with the decision making, but not for people who just said, I don't want this, and I want you to listen to me say that I don't want this. Now finally, the local context was critical. As I said, the abattoir closure set the scene for how this was interpreted, but this also affected the local context. In fact, as a result of this engagement process, local elections saw the Council of King Island change significantly. So a lot of people stood for election who hadn't before, and others stood down for the first time. Now I'm running out of time, but there's a paper on this research. It's open access and there's a link there, and I'm happy to email it through if you get in touch with me. You can read more. I've given 2-hour lectures on this topic. There's a lot more to the story than I've been able to share. But I hope that speaks to some of those complexities of the engagement process. So thanks for listening, and I'll hand back to Anne.
Thank you so much, Beck. Excellent. I just want to, again, encourage folks that if you have questions, please don't be shy. Just type them in on the bottom left text field there, and we will have a group discussion at the end of all the presentations and get to your questions. So next, we have Emily Grubert. Emily is a PhD candidate at Stanford University. Emily studies how community and societal priorities can be better incorporated into energy policy and project decisions. Her recent work has focused on social life cycle assessment and climate and life cycle assessment, as well as water intensity and energy systems. So Emily, if you are ready, I will pass it over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Anne. Can everyone hear me all right? Cool. Seeing no complaints in the chat box, I'll go forward. So yes, thank you very much for inviting me to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity and look very much forward to our discussion at the end. As Anne said, thanks Julia, I will load off a little bit. As Anne said, I look largely at multi-criteria prioritization and really look a lot at trying to bring social science methods and social science tools into engineering techniques for making decisions. So my background is in civil engineering, and then I am now in an interdisciplinary program largely looking at things like social life cycle assessment and just societal preferences generally. The major thesis that I put forth that's a little bit more controversial when I talk to engineering audiences, but I think is probably pretty well understood here, is that communities are affected by energy development. This is something that is pretty well known. It's seen in so many different contexts around the world. The particular case studies that I look at are coal, oil, and solar. Kind of interestingly, when I started this project, the case study areas that I was looking at were all in reasonably good shape, actually. And then basically within a year or so of when I started, all of my case study areas started to see some major issues happening, actually. So I look at coal mines in regions that have had major bankruptcies and large amounts of layoffs. Similarly, the oil price collapsed pretty quickly after I started working on this. And then some of the solar that I look at has been plagued by some technical difficulties and other issues, very notably killing birds. So if you're familiar with concentrating solar power and some of the controversy around birds flying into the flux and getting burned, that's one of the plants that I work with. So it's kind of my basic premise. Also similarly, and something that I don't think is controversial probably in this audience particularly, is that these communities are pretty diverse, not only in just who lives there in the cultural setting, but also in the geographic setting, the environmental setting, and some of the needs of the communities going forward. So the way that I decided to approach this was to look at some paired case studies. So 2 concentrating solar power plants, one in Southern California and one in Central Nevada, 2 major shale oil fields, so one in Texas and one in North Dakota, and then 2 major coal mining areas, one in Australia and one in Wyoming. The basic goal of my work is to look at how people actually make trade-offs and evaluate the types of outcomes that are going on when big projects like these do come to a community. Life cycle assessment is a pretty common engineering tool that's getting more and more common. Pretty notably, actually, life cycle assessment is also something that's starting to be required in certain policy processes, and so this is a particularly salient issue in that context, just because since this is explicitly part of the decision process now, it seems reasonable to think about how that's going forward. For those that aren't familiar with life cycle assessment in particular, the basic idea is that you try to look at all of the different environmental and increasingly social outcomes associated with a product, process, or policy. So how much climate change burden is there, how much smog burden is there, and then a bunch of other things. The big problem with life cycle assessment, the way that I see it, is that there are really no concrete ways of making those trade-off decisions once you have the data. And so in the engineering community, we tend to focus very much on figuring out how much impact there is. That data is then generally presented to decision makers without any additional support, and then they're basically left with somewhere between 15 and 30 indicators worth of data and really no indication of how to make trade-offs. So I ran a pretty large survey in the United States and Australia in these particular energy communities, trying to get a sense of how important the various trade-offs that are part of life cycle assessment might be. Multi-criteria decision-making generally, so anytime you need to make these trade-offs about things that are fundamentally non-comparable, is a huge challenge in sustainability assessment generally. It's not just life cycle assessment. The part that I look at is really, once you understand a certain amount of something, how do you compare one category to another? There's also a value judgment and a comparison issue just with things inside a given category. So if the water pollution versus job creation example, within water pollution, you have to decide whether one type of water pollution is different from another type of water pollution and that sort of thing. Within job creation, similarly, something that people talk about a lot is the difference between a temporary job versus a long-term career style job. Those types of comparisons need to be made as well. I look at how to compare the water pollution versus the job creation types of questions once you've kind of got that through. I'll just say briefly that prioritization, this idea of how to trade off different types of criteria, is probably the single most sensitive parameter in this decision support tool. So the fact that it's not generally considered in a lot of the literature is, I think, fairly important, and that's why I've been working on it. I'll note also that one of my big pushes has been to improve the uptake of social life cycle assessment, so looking not only at environmental impacts but also on social impacts. Prioritizing across different criteria becomes even harder once you start thinking about both at the same time, in addition to some of the economic issues that people talk about. A comment also quickly that one of the big motivations for doing this is that even though the tool is intended to be, from the engineering side, an objective tool that doesn't impose value judgments, that's obviously something that is basically impossible to do because the way that you present something involves value judgments, etc. But even further, based on a digital analysis of all of the life cycle assessment literature that's come out in the last 20 years or so, so this is about 8,300 journal articles, what's visible is that there's a very, very clear tendency for the literature to prioritize climate change, particularly at the expense of looking at health impacts. So it's already non-objective. There are already prioritizations happening, and so a lot of my work is trying to figure out how to make those types of trade-offs more transparent and figure out who's really responsible for making those choices. I want to move on just to the quick meat of it, but a lot of the work that I've been doing is kind of trying to convince both the engineering community and the social science community that both have a lot of contributions to make in this area, and that within this method there are different places where it's more appropriate to use the tools of one tradition versus the other. And then, yeah, the ultimate outcome of the work that I've been doing is essentially to generate a bunch of empirical archetypes that can be used for sensitivity analysis. So looking at different communities and trying to figure out what patterns of priority are present there. The idea is that these types of patterns could be used to test the sensitivity of a decision. So if you're trying to decide between A and B, if you use the priorities of one archetype and see that the answer should be A, and then you test it with these other sensitivities as well, and in all cases you want to make the same decision, that's probably a pretty robust decision. If you test it using all of these different archetypes and you see that there's a major conflict with one type of outcome, so say one group of people in the community potentially is very, very interested in protecting the water system, and another is very, very interested in maintaining high wages, and that creates a situation where one group might be more interested in A versus B. That's also valuable information. I should note also that the intent of this is not to replace community consultation. The intent is for tabletop analyses where people are doing something before they actually present it back to the folks that commission a project or something like that, they show that they've done this sensitivity analysis and that they see that there are some potential points of conflict. In my last couple of minutes, I just wanted to note quickly that I've also been doing a lot of qualitative interviews to try to get a sense of why these archetypes emerge. The one that I've been working on most clearly now, so just if anyone has any questions for the discussion at the end, has been the Eagle Ford Shale in Texas and the Bakken Shale in North Dakota, two oil-producing areas, both fairly familiar with oil, but both experiencing major booms and busts right now. The biggest thing that's emerged from this is that people are all a little bit they're excited in some ways that there's a new opportunity coming through, but they're also very aware that the bust that has come through now is something that's likely to stay for a while. So just talking through how people think about long-term impacts, both on the social side and the environmental side, and whether that's worth some of the short-term gains when they're not in a bust cycle has been really interesting. So if anyone's curious about that.
Thank you so much, Emily. Excellent. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to quickly move on to Sean Olson-Hasboon. Sean is a PhD candidate in sociology at Utah State University. She is an environmental and natural resources sociologist, and her research interests include energy production, climate change, and political sociology. So with that, I will pass it over to Sean if you're ready, Sean.
Yep. And I have control of the, there we go, perfect, okay. Great, so thanks so much for the introduction and for having me. Today I'll give an overview of 3 related research areas I've been working on and then briefly describe some of the actual projects I've recently completed. Sorry if this seems like a somewhat scattered way of presenting research, but I just really wanted to get a sense of the bigger questions I'm asking in my work as a whole. I include just some pictures of me doing research in energy communities, but I think I'll skip explanations of those in the interest of time. But I did want to say that I've been living in Utah the last 4 years, and it's been a really awesome place to study some of the questions that I have, because there's a lot of different types of energy production going on in Utah, as well as a really interesting political climate. So it's been a good social laboratory. Okay, so scholars have examined a variety of community responses to renewable energy, including both opposition and acceptance, and have highlighted some of the important factors involved. We know that place attachment and landscape aesthetics are important, and concerns about community benefits and community engagement. But today I'm going to kind of widen the lens just a little bit, and if we do so, we notice evidence of renewable energy being a political issue in both regional and national energy and environmental debate. On the right, there's 2 pictures from Idaho. It's a billboard campaign with some broad messaging about how renewable energy is not clean, not green, it's a swindle, it's a scam, it's comparable to prostitution with its own type of red light district. So I'm just really sort of interested in this dimension of renewable energy and public response. So broadly, my research interests have been inspired by a question Ben Sovacool asked in his important 2014 article, what types of politics can make the numerous energy and climate policies we discuss achievable? I think this is directly relevant to think about how the public responds to policies and technologies involved in the clean energy transition. So today, the 3 research areas I'll cover are, hang on a second, I've got to start my timer, there we go, are the relationship between renewable energy perceptions and environmental beliefs, particularly about climate change. And then related to that is how political and ideological stances relate to people's views on renewables. And then lastly, how responses to renewable energy are shaped by existing community economic histories. So I'll start with the first. In terms of how environmental beliefs might influence response to renewable energy, particularly beliefs about climate change, we know that though the majority of Americans believe climate change is occurring, only about half think this is due to human activities, particularly the burning of fossil fuels. We also know there's an ever-widening gap in the political polarization on climate change and what to do about it. And when we think about renewable energy in the way that we often see it framed, it sort of begs the question, if renewable energy is framed as a carbon mitigation effort, will this contribute to politicization and future public opposition, both at the national and the community level? And I think this is a particularly relevant question given where much of renewable energy, large-scale renewable energy facilities are built. For example, where I do my research in the Intermountain West, large-scale wind and solar facilities are built in rural areas that tend to be very politically conservative, and also that often have strong ties to traditional extractive industries. So to address this question, my colleagues and I conducted a survey in 5 different rural communities in the Intermountain West, in Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming, that were experiencing wind energy development in some way. Just a little touch of background. Our sampling frame was 250 individuals per community, and we got a great response rate, ended up with 906 responses. And really the goal is to kind of ask a variety of questions on individuals' attitudes toward the environment, climate change, renewable energy in general, and the particular local wind energy facility in the community. We hypothesized that perhaps views towards renewable energy in the abstract and renewable energy in terms of the actual local facility perhaps would be different. And what we found in terms of environmental beliefs is really that environmental beliefs nor beliefs about climate change were very relevant for predicting how community residents felt about renewable energy or the local facility in particular. But local level factors, including where the turbines were placed, how much access to information the community had from the developer, and impressions or beliefs about the economic aspects of renewable energy in their communities were a lot more important. And so this suggests that local experience itself may trump pre-existing beliefs about renewable energy or the environment. So I've also done, and I just wanted to point out, I've got an article on energy research and social science detailing this project. If anybody wants it, I'd be happy to share it. I've also been finishing up a qualitative project on this subject in which I examined discourses about renewable energy and environment in rural Utah communities. So I did interviews in 3 different rural energy producing communities in Utah. One was a renewable energy community, actually had significant amounts of wind and solar facilities and other types of renewable energy projects. I also had a coal community and an oil and gas community, and these are places where that was the dominant economic activity. And I interviewed 68 individuals representing various sectors of local society. And just in terms of some of the big picture findings, I don't have time to go into too much details, but in general I found that positivity toward renewable energy was really centered around non-environmental discourse or discursive frames, especially economic development, but also energy security. I also found a notable lack of environmental concern across all 3 study sites, particularly about air quality issues, which are really prevalent in Utah, and a pervasive climate skepticism. And then interestingly, I found that negativity toward renewable energy seemed to originate for many individuals in large part from anger over what many saw as climate alarmism in our country, and sort of anger over government interference in the free market. Which kind of brings me to my next research area, looking at the influence of political stances and viewpoints on renewable energy responses, both in the country at large, but also within communities. We know from prior studies that there's a connection between the political split over climate change, denial of climate change, and opposition to renewable energy. And in some cases, individuals may view incentives and other policy tools to foster renewable energy as an inappropriate manipulation of the free market, signaling kind of an adoption of a free market ideology, or the idea that the free market, unencumbered by regulations, can provide the greatest good for the greatest number. So just like some bigger picture findings from these 2 research projects I've touched on, number 1, I found that political ideology within the 5 community survey projects that I already talked about was also not a very significant variable and was greatly outshined by some of those local contextual factors I talked about. However, I did find that opposition to environmental governance and environmental regulations was related to negative views towards renewable energy. And I think that's interesting because it shows that for many individuals, renewable energy is seen as connected to environmental policy and regulation versus being just a local energy issue. Energy development issue. In the qualitative project, I found that political stances were connected to community views about renewable energy. I found in these places that neoliberal ideology was really normalized across all the study sites and was used as a justification for why renewable energy might not be viable, because particularly the idea that it needs government help by subsidies or incentives. I also found anger and angst about renewable energy, especially in the two extractive communities, the coal and the oil and gas community. And this seemed to originate in large part from the feeling that renewable energy itself was part of the liberal or progressive agenda, and that it was also at the expense of fossil fuel economies. However, interestingly, I found that renewable energy was much less political in the community that had the existing renewable energy facilities. So even though community members in this place expressed also very conservative political views as well as neoliberal viewpoints, they were they sort of had they framed renewable energy on less political terms and talked more about its economic contributions or its local impacts or benefits. So just kind of an example of that, here's a quote from a county commissioner I talked to in the renewable energy community, and he says, this is someone who's very supportive of renewable energy and wants more to come to his community, but he said, I think it should be left to private business. That's going to be a caveat you catch me on because I would like to see more renewable energy to be located here, but I think that they should stand on their own 2 feet. If it's not feasible, then our government should stay out of it and go back to the hydrocarbons. So that's kind of illustrative of my point. Okay, so then just the last project I want to briefly touch on is research I'm doing to examine how renewable energy is perceived in extractive communities. Sorry about the typo in the first bullet point. The research is pertinent given the geographic overlap in terms of where renewable energy is developed and where traditional energy extraction occurs. And the central question is if communities already used to energy production might be open to renewable energy development, or whether these places might exhibit a particular type of resistance. And the qualitative project I've already described kind of delves into this question, but I'm also conducting a national scale quantitative analysis using opinion data from the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication. So just to kind of show you, I've got this really great data set. It's 8 years of survey data from the Climate Change in the American Mind Survey. This map just shows the geographic distribution of responses. And I've basically built a multi-level model, a regression model using the survey data, and then using county-level oil and gas production, as well as the categorization as a mining-dependent county as identified by the USDA Economic Research Services county topology codes. And basically what I'm trying to do is understand, well, how does residents in a mining-dependent or an oil and gas county influence people, does it mean that individuals would be more or less likely to support renewable energy? In this case, policies is the dependent variable, renewable energy policies. And some of the things that I've found, sorry to put these all up at once, let's just focus on the first chunk. And again, I'm just presenting just big picture results. I found that individuals residing in either a mining-dependent county or a county that produces natural gas were less likely to support renewable energy policies, and this effect was as great as some of the sociodemographic variables like education and gender, and then also the effect of living in a mining-dependent county was as great as the effect of political ideology, which I found to be significant. And then how do we interpret these results? Well, I looked to my qualitative work for some answers here, and in terms of that project and this research question, I found in the two fossil fuels communities, I found a predominant feeling that the community's economic health was under attack by the push toward renewable energy. In particular, communities felt that fossil fuels were kind of all they had and that they were already compromised by their rurality and their lack of other economic options. And individuals felt that the push toward renewable energy was sort of directly linked to the decline of coal, for example. One mayor I interviewed said he didn't want to see solar panels on anything in his community because solar panels take food out of the mouths of miners. That's a quote. There's also kind of this feeling, just as one last point, that residents of these communities felt that renewable energy would be sort of incongruent with their local cultural identity. As one business owner I spoke to said, you bring in renewable energy and you bring in the tree huggers. Okay, so just, I know I'm out of time here to finish up. I just want to end by saying that I think a direction, kind of following from these results, a direction I think myself and other energy social scientists need to go is to examine the costs of the clean energy transition in terms of how these costs might be disproportionately distributed, and we need to look at how certain communities already marginalized by the existing system of energy production could be further marginalized or left behind in the transition. and we need to figure out how we can achieve a just transition to a clean energy system. And I hope that what I've described here sort of contributes to understanding how concerns about some of the negative community impacts of the clean energy transition might influence public views toward the new technologies that drive the transition itself. Okay, and with that, I will turn it back over to Anne.
And so in the interest of time, I think we're going to go on to Dylan quickly. Again, I want to encourage folks, if you have questions, just type them in to the field on the bottom left of your screen, and we will get to each of them once we're finished with Dylan's presentation here. So finally, we have Dylan Bugden. Dylan is a PhD candidate at Cornell University. His primary research interests are in place theory and natural resource and environmental sociology, with a focus on energy development. His current research focuses on the sociological nature of place and its role in land use conflict, as well as environmental justice in the shale gas industry, and sociological theories of energy transitions. So with that, Dylan, if you're ready, I'll pass it over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
All right, terrific. So the project that I'm going to describe today is the near completion of a multi-year effort by myself and my advisor, Rich Stedman, here at Cornell, looking at environmental justice in the shale gas industry. So the reason that that we're asking this question of environmental justice in the shale gas industry largely is because of a transition that's been going on in the United States for the last 10 or so years, where the two primary new sources of energy development, renewable and shale oil and gas, are in parts of the country happening on privately owned land. And it's happening on property that's owned by working class families in somewhat impoverished to middle income communities. And so there has been quite a bit of media coverage and some scholarly attention paid to the environmental justice implications of this, with the narrative largely being that landowners are disenfranchised and are experiencing a significant amount of environmental risk without much benefit, a sort of classic environmental justice case. And it struck my advisor and I as being somewhat of an overly simplistic analysis that missed some key features of this particular kind of energy development. It also wasn't representative of some sort of anecdotal things we had heard. And so we wanted to try to undertake a pretty robust multi-method analysis of this environmental justice question. And so if you're going to ask questions of environmental justice, you really have to look at two separate things. You want to look at procedural questions, which are somewhat related to agency, although I'm going to treat it a little bit differently today. And you're also looking at issues of distributive justice. So it's both how landowners are participating and if they have a voice in that process, and then whether or not they're receiving adequate benefit for the risks that they're taking on. And so if both of these things are absent, if you have very little benefit and a lot of environmental risk, and you have very little voice in the process, you get a classic case of environmental injustice. And these are really the two research questions that drove this project. So the study design, what I'm going to talk about today mostly is the survey. We also have interviews with 30 of the landowners. Those interviews will be finished tomorrow, but I don't have any analysis with that yet. What I can say about that is it does generally reflect the narrative that's going to come out of this presentation, but I'll refrain from actually including any interview data. And then we also have an analysis of the leases themselves that belonged to the landowners. That's not quite complete, but we do have some preliminary results from that support the story we're telling here. So the survey, we have 873 respondents from Bradford and Susquehanna counties in northeast Pennsylvania. These are two of the most densely developed counties in the country for shale oil and gas extraction. We had a response rate of about 35%, which is okay, but not great. So we did do a non-response survey with our non-respondents that showed no really significant or meaningful differences between the two. So we feel like we have a pretty representative sample here for landowners in these two counties. In the survey, we cover a number of things. Of course, demographics. We did code for who they signed their lease with, which is an important part of this process. I'll discuss in a little bit. Then some sort of traditional environmental justice questions like procedural fairness. We asked them to self-report social, financial, and environmental outcomes to try to get at where the risks and benefits are being distributed here. And we also asked about self-efficacy and satisfaction and much more, but I'm only going to focus on these. I can certainly answer questions about other things we've covered when I'm done. The leases we coded primarily for the presence or absence of addenda. Addenda are non-standard contractual terms that landowners really have to negotiate for. So they have to be heavily involved and engaged in the process and have some power in their negotiations with the energy firm to achieve these things. What we're coding for specifically, and we don't have the actual contents yet, we only have presence absence. But what's typically in these addenda, and what we're coding for, are increases in royalty rates, moving from as little as 12.5%, which is the minimum standard, up to as much as 20%, an inclusion of a range of environmental clauses, and then a number of procedural terms related to either how disputes will be settled through arbitration or in court, and as well as where actual facilities will be sited on people's property. And the interviews covered similar things, but again, I won't be talking about those today. This will just give you an idea. I want to note, if you don't have your screen maximized, you might want to, because I'm going to have a lot of figures and tables coming up here in a minute. So you'll have a hard time reading them if you don't otherwise. But this map just gives you an idea, for those of you who aren't familiar, where Bradford and Susquehanna counties are. They're in the top right corner. The orange dots are sputted wells. So as you can see, these are two really heavily developed areas in Pennsylvania. Demographically, our population is older, more educated, and a little bit wealthier than the average resident of Bradford and Susquehanna counties. That's not a terrible surprise, given that we're talking about landowners here. These are people who own property. So it's not a representative population of the county, but rather of landowners themselves. The firms that were actually active, there really were three primary players: Chesapeake, who most of you will be familiar with, Cabot Oil and Gas, who was a large player, and then Fortuna. Alta and Chief were really the only other two significant players, and then there were maybe 20 or 30 other small firms engaged. So we are going to treat agency a little bit differently from procedural justice for now, and I can talk about why that is at the end. But to do this, we're going to look at the leases, the presence or absence of addenda, as well as a few different survey items. So 85% of the leases that we coded, of the full leases we have, many of the leases we have are memoranda leases, which are not really codable. But of those that were full leases, 85% did include an addenda. I can say anecdotally, because we don't have a full analysis of it yet, these addenda tended to be pretty sophisticated, included many terms. The most common was a change in royalty rate to increase it. But there's considerable instances of environmental protections included, especially water testing, as well as a number of clauses related to where facilities will be placed on the property, how much say the landowner would have in various things that were going on. So there was a substantial amount of negotiation that appears to have gone into this. That landowners were not simply accepting the first contract that was offered them, but they were actually really agentic players in this negotiation process. There were two other things we were able to ask on the survey that I think indirectly point to this question of agency. One is that about 33% of our participants did attend landowner coalition meetings, which suggests that they went sort of above and beyond the average effort to try to become informed and to negotiate the lease terms. And then about half actually did use an attorney. Again, similar to the landowner coalition data, indicates some level of going above and beyond the standard to try to become involved in the process and leverage whatever power they may have had. We also just asked them, this is a 4-item measure of self-efficacy. We just asked them how capable they felt they were along a number of dimensions related to negotiating a lease. Of course, landowners felt themselves to be very self-efficacious, but I would be cautious in interpreting this because there may be reasons for which I'll touch on in a bit. So in terms of just standard environmental justice, we think about it on two criteria, one procedurally and another distributively. So we're going to focus on our measures of procedural fairness. So as we move from left to right, you're seeing more positive experiences. They were agreeing with a positively worded item, and there are 7 of these, and I'll go through them quick. As you can see, they're either slightly skewed positive or they're fairly evenly distributed. So this really is not, there isn't a lot of observation of procedural inequality or equality. When you put it together in a composite, you see it skews slightly positive, that the modal interpretation of their interactions with the energy firms is actually one of procedural equality. where they did have a voice in the process. However, this is not a strong, it doesn't skew strongly in that direction. There actually are quite a few instances, a lot of people who did feel that there was a procedural inequality in the process. I won't present the data on this here for lack of time, but I will say that Chesapeake explains a lot of the variation in this. So if you signed with Chesapeake, you were much more likely to perceive procedural inequality than if you signed with anyone else, which is important when we want to talk about trying to understand the narrative around this leasing process. Financially, landowners benefited. There's just no way around this. About 70% of our respondents made over $10,000. Almost half earned $50,000 or greater, and almost a third earned over $100,000, with another 13% earning over $250,000. So certainly on the benefit side, landowners benefited very simply. So it becomes a question then of if there were other risks that make up for the financial benefit they may have received. Socially, really didn't have much of an impact on their lives. Certainly their family quality of life was better off, though this is explained, of course, by their financial benefit. Environmentally, this is where it gets very interesting. So we asked them to self-report whether their land, surface water, or drinking water was better off or worse off than it was before leasing, after leasing. 9% said their land was worse off, but only 4% and only 6% said their surface water was worse off, and only 6% said their drinking water was worse off. So again, the modal reality for these landowners in this industry is not one of frequent environmental hazard or environmental risk. The modal experience is one of high financial benefit with very little environmental risk associated with it. Obviously, it's difficult to do a direct trade-off between risks and benefits, so we asked them how satisfied they were with the experience overall. We just had them do a self-evaluation of their own. 16% said they were dissatisfied. About 14% said it was worse than they anticipated. But a significant majority thought it was much better than they anticipated, and a significant majority were either satisfied or very satisfied with the experience. So what predicts satisfaction? Really quick. Of course, the process. The perception or not of procedural inequality is by far the strongest explanation, as you can see with the standardized coefficient. Self-efficacy also explains it, but I would caution that interpretation, or I would add to that interpretation a caution of bidirectionality. It's possible that people who are more satisfied believe that they were more capable because they're satisfied. And then, of course, the financial earnings also explain it. What is absolutely counterintuitive, and there's a first authorship and an authorship for anyone who can help me explain this. The violation rate is positively associated with satisfaction. So the more violations that occurred in your town, the more satisfied you were. And I checked this for reverse coding, and that does not appear to be a problem. So this is a bit of an outlier and a confusing result in this analysis. So the implications for shale gas, really, this is the first, to my knowledge, the first real quantification of what this leasing process and its outcomes are for landowners in heavily developed regions. There is evidence of somewhat of a bad egg hypothesis that Chesapeake really is the primary explanation for a lot of the problems. I obviously haven't presented that data, but we have that elsewhere. There's just some other findings that university resources really were not effective in reaching out to landowners. And there is something of a disconnect between knowledge, which we measure through a quiz, and their self-efficacy, where their quiz scores are actually quite poor, but they believe themselves to be very effective negotiators. In terms of environmental justice, this presents a bit of a counter argument to the standard narrative about environmental justice in the shale gas industry, which is one of fairly extreme disenfranchisement. The evidence here that really is backed up by the interviews, even though I'm not presenting it, is one of of widespread agency, a lot of benefit, and not as much risk as is often portrayed. And it also highlights the important role of private property. One of the things that makes shale gas sort of an unusual fit for the standard environmental justice narrative is that this is not occurring on land owned by a small group of people. It's happening on land owned by a lot of people. And they have capacity in that interaction, because of the structure of the law, to negotiate for contractual terms that really do benefit them. The next steps really just are to finish coding the interviews and the addenda, although again, sort of anecdotally, my sense is that they'll support generally what you've seen here. And with that, I will wrap it up and open up to questions, I suppose.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much, Dylan. Thank you to our panelists. This has been just really a lot of fun. It's been really fantastic. I want to quickly plug again that so in the next day or so, this webinar will be available along with our past webinars in this series at energyimpacts.org/webinars. And so moving on, I want to see, it looks like a couple folks are typing. If we have any questions, I can just go through and kind of read them and pass it over to our panelists. I think while we're waiting, so I'm sort of wondering, just we have a couple minutes left here. So in varying ways, it seems like each of you sort of touched on energy development as a political issue. So you touched on issues of community power, enfranchisement, environmental justice, things like that. So I'm wondering what role you see for us as social scientists in examining such kinds of community impacts related to energy development and what may be and often are vastly different political economies in vastly different energy plays. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that. If not, we can move on to Hillary's question too.
I'll just comment on what you mentioned, Anne, and something that I experienced from my research was that the community I worked with was really receptive to the research I was doing as kind of an outsider and objective perspective on their experiences. So I think as well as what we can learn for the sake of academic research, I think the people out there really want new perspectives. So it's something we can offer.
Sure. That might have been a question that would have just been better for more time, but I want to make sure that we can kind of touch on, thanks so much, Beck. I want to make sure that we can touch on some of the questions that folks have typed here. So Hillary asks, chicken or egg, does the leasing process and experience build support, or does it only move forward with people already predisposed to support and
yes.
thus be satisfied with the process?
So this is, this is the second time I've given this presentation, and it's the second time this is basically the first question that someone asked. My impression, this has been quantified in certain counties, but I haven't seen it for Bradford, Susquehanna. My impression is basically everyone leased. This is a random sample of those leasers. There are tens of thousands of these leases, and we took about 3,500 at random. And these are the folks who responded. It's possible that people who responded were more positive about their experience, but that's why we did the non-response bias check, to check for that. And that was the first question, was satisfaction, was to see if they varied in that regard. And they didn't. So I'm not sure if that's answering your question, Hillary. I'm not sure if that's answering your question. You can follow up if that makes sense.
As Hillary's typing,
I can answer Julia's question while Hillary's typing.
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, so we do have the year that they signed the lease. In looking at a regression on satisfaction, year has no effect. It's actually really, I have a graphic, but I cut it out for time. The leases are basically all signed in the same time period. Something like 86%, I think, were signed in 2008, 2009. So there's not a lot of variation in when it was actually signed. In terms of the network effect, so we have measures of social capital. If they talked to other people to get information, so here, if I actually can skip, can I go to the very last? Oh, you cut out my last two slides. The most frequently used source of information were family and friends. So there's absolutely some kind of network effect, and maybe not in the, I'm not sure, maybe if you mean like a snowballing with landmen, or if there's like a network effect in like the transmission of knowledge and expertise. I certainly think in the transmission of knowledge and expertise it's happening because that's what people were using. Universities and government agencies were absolutely unhelpful for these folks. They were really relying on their friends and family, and believe it or not, the oil and gas company itself were the two most frequently used. They were not necessarily the most helpful, but they were the ones that were most frequently used. The most helpful were attorneys and landowner coalitions.
So thanks so much, Dylan. Just in the interest of time, if folks want to follow up with our presenters, everybody's email should be there at the bottom of the screen, so please feel free to reach out to them. Again, this webinar as well as our past webinars will be available in the next day or two at energyimpacts.org/webinars. I just want to extend a big thanks and appreciation to our panel. This has been just really illuminating and also a lot of fun. And thanks again also to everybody that participated. So I hope everybody has a great afternoon. Be sure to check out the symposium on the energyimpacts.org website. And with that, I think we can call